On behalf of the Global Issues Speaker Committee and the DCA, I would like to welcome you to our special event with Representative Jim Himes. My name is Mary Jenko. Kate Larson and I serve as co-chairs of the Speakers Committee. Every year since 1956, a group of women have joined together to explore a foreign policy topic for which they wanted a deeper understanding. They also wanted to share with the community what they were learning. To pursue this mission, they started inviting experts to come to Darien each January to offer lectures, to educate, inform, and challenge beliefs. The topics often had an eye to the future. 2024 is no different. This year's topic, Technology and Geopolitics, What's Ahead, is based on the recognition that emerging technologies are creating seismic shifts in global power. We've had 3 lectures so far, one covering international cyber conflict, the second, how technology is changing the face of war, and this past Tuesday, a lecture on power in the age of artificial intelligence. I must confess, as a member of the committee, it is always so rewarding to hear the enthusiasm and appreciation of attendees as they leave after another thought-provoking lecture by one of these experts. For those of you who've been unable to attend any of this year's lectures, don't fret. We have 2 more to come. Registration for both of these lectures is still open, and additional information can be found on the DCA website. Next Thursday, February 1st at 10, Sarah Cook, Senior Advisor for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House, will discuss Beijing's global media influence, key trends, emerging tactics, and their implications. As we get deeper into this important presidential election year, the potentially corrosive impact on democracy of deepfakes and misinformation cannot be ignored. The following week, Wednesday evening, February 7th, starting with a reception at 7:30, Sam Sachs, a senior fellow at Yale Law School Paul Tsai China Center, will discuss U.S.-China relations and the geopolitics of data flows. Is data the real currency of power in the age of AI, as suggested by Paul Shari, last Tuesday's speaker? Is it today's oil? All lectures are live streamed and recorded, so if you can't be there at the DCA or here at the DCA or aren't available at the exact time, registrants can request a recording. Which brings us to our discussion today. With all these changes caused by emerging technologies, what should the role of the federal government be? Before I introduce our special guest, I want to mention that there will be an opportunity for your questions as well. There are no doubt many questions you'd like to ask Representative Himes, but today's conversation should be focused on the role of the federal government with regards to emerging technology. Now on to our guest. Jim Himes represents Connecticut's 4th District in the U.S. House of Representatives and serves as ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and on the House Financial Services Committee. Given that he is now serving his 8th term, I don't think he needs much more of an introduction to this group. However, he does deserve our deep gratitude for making time to be with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Representative Jim Himes.
Thank you, Mary, and a big thank you to the DCA and to all of you for coming out for this really important conversation, and I'm delighted to have it. You know, our politics are such today that the opportunity to talk about technology, which tends not to be partisan or all that argumentative, maybe a little scary, but does not tend to get caught up in the maw of our partisan and polarized political system, is a real treat. And my plan is to maybe speak for 20 minutes tops and then leave a lot of time for questions, because there's a lot of angles to this technology question. And I'll start by saying that this is something that has been of great interest to me for a long time, thinking primarily from a national security standpoint. One of the reasons that the United States has been able to be a guarantor of, what we've come to call the international rules-based system is because we have, since World War II, had a pretty substantial technological lead over our adversaries. And that is about one of, I think, maybe not unique, maybe unique is too strong a word, but almost unique innovative capacity in this country. And that's something that we, I think, underappreciate as we have a nice paranoia as Americans. You know, we worry in the 1980s that the Japanese were going to overtake us, and then now we're worried about the Chinese. The truth is our innovative capacity is such that we're really kind of hard to compete with. This is a very smart group, so you can probably do what I usually challenge other people to do, which is, name a French technology company like Google or Microsoft my point obviously being that innovative companies get started here because of the innovative ecosystem, which is an amazing combination of a lot of things, but the two that really bear consideration in the context of what should the federal government do and how competitive are we, are the commitment that we made starting in World War II, actually as World War II was on. If you saw Oppenheimer, that was the moment when the federal government said, wow, there is a threat. The Nazis are making progress towards an atomic bomb, and the catastrophe that emerges if they get there first is such that, well, you saw the movie Oppenheimer, where for really the first time ever, the federal government made a very concerted effort to be out in front and to fund the innovative capacity of the country. And the truth is that we have remained that country largely as a result of the people who came after the Manhattan Project. For those of you who follow this stuff, Vannevar Bush, who was an MIT professor, persuaded both FDR and Truman that it was critical to the national security and the prosperity. We'll come back to the internet and all that good stuff, because a lot of the roots of the technology that has created American prosperity, you can trace back to some very early basic research funded by the federal government through entities like DARPA, NIH, etc. But anyway, Vannevar Bush convinces Harry Truman that the government has a significant role to play, and as a result, these organizations like DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agencies, IARPA, intelligence, we now have ARPA-E, which does innovation in the energy sphere, are doing the kind of basic research that keeps us innovative. And it's not just those groups, right? Go to Lincoln Labs in Massachusetts. I don't know if people have connections in Massachusetts, but outside of Massachusetts, in Lincoln, Massachusetts, is Lincoln Labs, which is a federal laboratory that collaborates with MIT, and the stuff that is coming out of these labs, and it's Sandia and it's Brookhaven. We've got this array of federally funded research labs that are really second to none. And then we've got our university system. England has Oxford and Cambridge, there's Sorbonne in Paris. We've got 2 dozen, maybe 3 dozen, maybe 4 dozen research universities of that caliber, all of which are working to keep us at the cutting edge of innovation. And a lot of that is federally funded. I get into these arguments, what's the role of government in the private sector? In technology, it's really clear. And the answer is, the basic research that IBM might not want to undertake, that Google might not want to undertake, because it's not clear that there's a commercial pathway, the federal government sponsors that. And by the way, they did that with semiconductors. The early research around semiconductors was done by the federal government. The internet was actually developed in government labs and university labs as a way to, for scientists and professors to communicate with each other. And I could go on, but every once in a while I wave this thing around. And I point out that this is actually the perfect example of American innovation, right? Because almost everything that's cool about this thing, including the GPS, by the way, the location services, it's a whole bunch of satellites circling overhead that were put up there by the government. And then, of course, Apple Computer and its various subcontractors create immense amounts of prosperity by commercializing that stuff. So it's a formula that really, really works. And that if we break, we're in trouble. And we're in trouble for 2 reasons. Number one, for the first time, we're facing what people like to call a near-peer competitor in innovation, and that's the Chinese. The Chinese have, yes, educated a lot of engineers to world-class caliber, stolen an awful lot of intellectual property, and kind of put that all together to put them in a position to be at the forefront of a lot of innovation. I worry a lot about the Chinese, but they lack that innovative ecosystem. They're really good at building an artificial intelligence city. They did this, a whole city that is devoted to artificial intelligence. But it's not clear that that's the model that succeeds with innovation, right? innovation is inherently chaotic. And this is one of the big problems around innovation. Innovation has to be accompanied by failure. There are venture capitalists who won't fund an entrepreneur who hasn't bankrupted a company, because if you haven't bankrupted a company, you don't know what failure looks like, and therefore you're really not as educated as you should be to succeed. And for whatever cultural reasons or hierarchical reasons, the Chinese are not generally comfortable with that kind of chaos and embracing of failure that is so important to our own innovative ecosystems. But it's really critical right now. Chinese, I said there were two reasons that I really focused on this. You know, we do have a near-peer competitor, and I don't want to overstate that. I don't want you to think that that's nothing but risk. The truth is that huge and amazing things could come from, believe it or not, collaboration with the Chinese. We're all conditioned to think like, okay, they're our new enemy or stuff. The reality is that around drug discovery, around artificial intelligence, we worry about artificial intelligence because it's inaudible, meaning you can't really tell what's going on. It can lead to chaotic outcomes. You know who hates inauditability and chaotic outcomes more than we do? The Chinese, right? And so there are lots of areas where I think we can cooperate. There are areas where we won't. I'll talk briefly about quantum computing, weaponization of artificial intelligence, where we're obviously not going to cooperate, but we can't forget that the development of a vaccine, lots of areas we could really benefit from cooperation. But the other reason I really focus hard on this is that our entire lifetimes, regardless of how old you are, we have been adjusting to new technologies, which are both in some almost inevitably frightening, but also open unbelievable doors of opportunity when a new technology is used well. And I'm going to mention three forms of technology and then focus on one of them, artificial intelligence, but that I really track very closely. Starting, and they're all, they all really illustrate both incredible opportunity as well as real threats. Start with quantum computing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because if you've ever dived into quantum physics, you know that it is almost unexplainable. But quantum computing will revolutionize computing because it takes advantage of quantum effects. At the smallest of levels, at the sort of individual electron and photon level, lots of weird things happen, including a particle being in not just one or two states, binary computing, which is the computers that we all carry today, yes or no, 0 or 1. A quantum particle can be in a lot of different states at once, and for reasons that I can't explain to you, that means you can have massively more powerful computers than you can with binary computer. The reason we are spending a lot of time and energy on that technology at the federal level right now is because one of the things that we know a quantum computer will be able to do will be to break all currently known cryptography. Now, okay, you say, gosh, that's good. Yes, that's very, very scary. So all of the banking you do online, the private emails you say, the private text, everything that is about privacy relies on unbreakable cryptography. And then you've got things like our nuclear command and control and the CIA writing to embassies in London. I mean, there's just a lot of things that we cannot have our adversaries or criminals looking at. And quantum computing raises the very real possibility that cryptography will no longer work. So we are investing a lot of time and energy in making sure that hopefully we are the first ones to arrive at that point, and time and energy in working on forms of cryptography that will not be breakable by quantum computers. Second, and slightly more scary maybe, is biosynthesis. What is biosynthesis? Genetics. The human genetic code is just a computer program, honestly. It's just a long and complicated series just a long series of information. That's what genetics are. And so one human genome, one molecule, is theoretically enough information from which to build a human being. It is also enough information and easier to build a virus. And if you can manipulate genetic code, which we can do right now, through a technology called CRISPR, some of you will be familiar with this, you can literally sit at a computer terminal and replace genetic strands in a way to alter life. It's a godlike capability. On the one hand, that promises things like drug discovery and incredible opportunities for therapies and cures. On the other hand, I tend to think a lot about national security. It offers the opportunity for viruses that can be targeted to certain genetic types. Conceivably even a virus that might only affect an individual. Think about the possibilities for assassinations or for genocide if populations have similar genotypes to similar genetic codes. Right now, there's a company, just to give you one example, in Boston called Ginkgo Biosynthesis, and they are literally using genetic manipulation to create new scents, smells, to create new drug compounds, to create new flavors, and to create new organisms. And I'll sort of close on this theme. This is the first time we're forced to confront the idea that, and this was sort of the theme of the movie Oppenheimer, that our technological capabilities are evolving beyond our ethical understandings. That we're being presented with technologies that have capabilities that are not natural for us to think about in the traditional, ethical realms that we think. So biosynthesis is a second area that I focus hard on. And then lastly, and we'll just spend a couple minutes on this, artificial intelligence. I know that you've had other speakers come talk about this, but absolutely fascinating with great promise and great risk. In the last 5 to 10 years, computers have stopped being programmed. Many of us had programming experience. In my case, it was learning to type BASIC, where you gave computers rules. And that's the way most computing works. Massive programs with lots of rules, and it's just a logical progression. Lately, neural networks. This is a neural network. We are not programmed. We call it learned, taught. We don't use programmed for humans. We call it teaching. We are not taught by being given a series of rules, by and large. A little bit, but more than anything else, we learn because these neural networks absorb an immense amount of data. We look at enough cats, at enough humans, at enough cars, at enough planes, so that eventually our neural networks get configured to understand almost intuitively, not rules, but intuitively what a cat or a plane or a dog is. And it gets much more advanced from there, right? So for the first time, computers are actually thinking, although a lot of artificial intelligence practitioners wouldn't agree with that word, but they are mimicking a process of human thought. And as a result, they act like humans in many cases. And if you've played with ChatGPT, you know how eerie that can be. And one thing is for sure, which is that as these models get larger, and as computing power gets larger, and as they are exposed to more and more data, and we have this massive repository of data known as the internet, right, where everything lives, they will become more human in their capabilities. I'm going to circle back around to that. But it is already true that things like drug identification, I can't explain it to you, but the process of understanding what sorts of compounds might address a particular virus or a bacteria is a very data-intensive, very labor-intensive process. Artificial intelligence makes very short work of drug identification, such that new drugs are being identified at a remarkable rate. Radiologists, I don't know if we have any radiologists in the room, but radiology involves an individual who has been programmed over decades to look at an image and to say, that's breast cancer, that's not. The truth is that an artificial intelligence algorithm can look at a lot more images than a lot of human beings can, and so the actual act of reading an image probably already is done better by artificial intelligence than it is by a human. Last example, because this poses all sorts of ethical quandaries. Artificial intelligence is making its way onto the battlefield in the form of autonomous weapons. And again, this gets us back to the question of have our values and our ethical reasoning kept up with our capabilities, our technological capabilities. It is today possible that you could have a swarm of small drones armed in some fashion that would be programmed to go after a target and would pursue that target without any intervention by human beings. And that raises profound issues that are hard. In some ways, it's the same as the self-driving car issue. All of us are a little uncomfortable with the concept of the self-driving car. Of course we are. But then we remember that 80,000 Americans or something die on the roads every year because we're actually not very good drivers. We do things like get tired, we text while we're driving, we have a few drinks and get behind the wheel. AI doesn't do any of that. So I use that as an example to say that autonomous weapon systems could be a lot more efficient, a lot more capable than human driven weapon systems. But gosh, do we want that? Do we want a world in which decisions of life and death are effectively being made by a neural network rather than an ethical being? Do I completely freak out about this? I actually don't, and I'm not a technologist myself, but I've spent an awful lot of time listening to really thoughtful AI scientists, and what I've come to believe is that a lot of the things that we fear most about AI are not things that an AI is going to naturally do. So we all know what it is to feel greed, to feel jealousy, to feel tribal, sadly. These are not, a lot of these things are not things that we necessarily learn in our neural networks, but which we inherit from thousands of years of evolution. Why are we greedy? We're greedy because over the many tens of thousands of years that we evolved as organisms, it made an awful lot of sense to hoard resources because, maybe not true today, but 10,000 years ago on the Kalahari, if you didn't hoard resources, your tribe was done. And so we developed all of these human traits that were adaptive to our environment. They were evolved behaviorally to help us adapt to environment. A computer neural network will never go through that. They will never feel jealous rage because some other man is looking at your wife that way. These are deeply evolved non-neural instincts that we think, well, what if a computer had those? Well, how would a computer get those, right? The computer didn't live through the tens of thousands of years that have adapted us into both good things and bad things. Tribalism. We use that word. We use that word negatively because it affects our politics, and generally speaking, we like to believe that we would choose to associate for something other than the color of our skin or our religion or our national origin. But you know where it comes from, right? I mean, we don't have claws. We're not very fast. If you're not in a tribe on the Kalahari 20,000 years ago, you're done. And so, it was an adaptive mechanism that it's hard to imagine a AI algorithm learning itself into. So what's the answer here? Two things, and then I'll shut up and we'll talk about whatever you like to talk about. We need to keep doing what we have always done, which is at the government level investing in basic research. The Council on Foreign Relations did a study of this. It was led by Admiral William McRaven. That's a name that will be familiar to some of you. He was a special operations admiral, and he's now gotten into really thinking about national security. And that commission recommended let's keep spending about 1% of our GDP on the basic research that means that we are the first to arrive at new technology. I have no problem saying that. I would rather arrive, given our societal and cultural values, at scary new technologies before the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians do. And so I have no problem saying that we should continue to invest that. We should support those companies that are almost acting like governments today. Google and Microsoft, they have the resources to act like a government. They're bigger than some governments, and they're now investing an immense amount of money in these things, and that I think should be regarded as a strength, even as we remember that private corporations or corporations have their own interests that we need to be mindful of as government or as a society. And then we need to invest in our people. And there's two things I have to say in this regard. Number one, we need to really keep investing in STEM or STEAM, however you want to think about it, but in those disciplines that will keep our people at the forefront of being engineers and doing the work. And by the way, the ethical reasoning that needs to be attached to technology. And here's where it gets a little contentious. We need to do a much better job with respect to immigration. And talk to any technologist, and they will tell you, you've got to get immigration right. By the way, look at the C-suite, the chief executives of our most innovative companies. Most of them are South Asian. You know, Google, of course, was founded by two Russians, right? Anyway, you get my point here, which is that if we're not going to be the recipients of the very best thinkers, the most creative people in the world, we damage our ability to be at the forefront of innovation. And then lastly, I get this question all the time because it comes up, AI deepfakes. Is Essie here? She told me she, yeah. So Essie Cup had a terrible experience. She just wrote an article about it, but a deepfake, you wrote an article about it, so I can mention it. A deepfake created a pornographic video with Essie's face on it. And that's just one example of a fairly traumatic to the individual, but of how powerful this technology can be when it's used for ill. You may have noticed that a week ago, actually up in New Hampshire, a deepfake was created of, I didn't listen to it, but it was Joe Biden's voice telling people not to vote in the New Hampshire election. And I want to close with this thought, which is, I get the question all the time, what is government going to do about that? And for better or for worse, the answer is going to be very limited things. And the reason for that is the First Amendment to the Constitution, where, you know, the idea is that no government can regulate your expression. And I said that I didn't say there's no role, I said there's a limited role because, at least certainly as long as I'm part of the government, I will oppose ideas of trying to identify information versus misinformation in anything other than the most factual way. You know, if somebody's out there on Facebook saying that you will cure COVID by drinking bleach, that's one thing. But if there's somebody out there saying, you know, making political statements, we've got to protect the ability for people to make political statements that aren't objectively identifiable as wrong, and need to be very, very careful about getting into the realm of having government control the expression of the citizenry. So if that's true, what do we need to do? We need to make sure that the citizenry is up to the challenges of our democracy. That is to say that we're the kind of critical thinkers that can identify misinformation, disinformation, deepfakes. I hope, maybe it's through better teaching of civics, maybe it's through a real concentration on critical thinking skills. I hope that we can arm individual citizens with the tools to be the thinkers, rather than saying there will be this government entity that will tell you what is a deep fake and what is not. That makes me really nervous. And I actually think that we have an immune system to bad information. This is not new, right? Talk to a Russian who was in the Soviet Union when Pravda was the news. I mean, they laughed at it, right? I mean, Pravda, you know, we have produced the records numbers of shoes and boots. You know, the Russian population knew it was absolute nonsense. Our own media environment, by the way, 100 years ago, the yellow journalism, you know, William Randolph Hearst, and you know, there's this whole argument that, you know, William Randolph Hearst single-handedly started the Spanish-American War, but I don't know if that's all true. But the point is, if you look at newspaper headlines of 100 years ago or 200 years ago, the media was much more brutal at the time, and people adjusted. They have sort of a commonsensical notion of what is true and what is not, and I think we got to work really, really hard to cultivate that. To me, the model of a citizen being armed to be a good, thoughtful citizen is more appealing than the government will tell that citizen kind of what is good and what is bad. So I think that has a lot to do with how we educate our young people in particular and the context that we put them in to be good critical thinkers. So let me stop there and we'll talk about whatever is interesting to you.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we have about a half an hour for some questions because Representative Hines has to leave at 4. But we're going to start with a couple of questions from our committee. So Kate Larson, and then we'll turn it over and we're going to alternate sides. We'll have members of the committee on either side and they'll hand you a microphone. Kate?
Hi, thanks for coming. And our speaker on Tuesday talked a little bit about the export controls that we have relative to the chips that are made in Taiwan and then sent to China. And there was a bipartisan group of House members who expressed concern that China would be able to circumvent those controls in the semiconductor industry by using the RISC-V technology, open source technology set that's used for development of custom processors. Are you worried about that? And if so, how should the US government respond?
Yeah, super interesting question. We have in this country, for those of you who don't follow this stuff closely, hopefully this is most of you, we have something called ITAR, which is a legal structure designed to keep dual-use technologies that could be used as weapons, and semiconductors are a good example of that, out of the hands of people that we would rather not have them. And that extends from everything from semiconductors to tubing they can use in missiles and stuff. And I guess I would say two things about it. Number one, ITAR works as a delaying tactic. So the Chinese are not capable today, and one of the reasons they're very, very angry at the US is that we have made it impossible for them to manufacture the most modern semiconductors. By the way, proud of Connecticut's 4th Congressional District. The reason for that is that these super high-end semiconductors are manufactured on machines built by an American-Dutch company called ASML, which makes them right up here in Wilton, Connecticut. These are house-sized machines that are, engineers will tell you they're the most complicated machine ever made by humans. And they're very, very hard to duplicate. The problem is, it's a terrible bet to bet against the propagation of technology. Eventually, technology gets out there. And so I think ITAR is very valuable as a delaying tactic. But along with making sure that the Chinese don't anytime soon come by 4-nanometer chips, let's also do all the work we need to do to dramatically reduce the probability that we actually ever need to fight the Chinese, because eventually they will get 4-nanometer technology. And so I'm a supporter of ITAR, but we should realize that technology will propagate in the end. And let's try to set the conditions that make it less likely that we'll use that technology against each other.
Jim, thanks for being here today. We really appreciate it. So I'm an educator, and one of the things that Paul Shard told us the other day that I thought was the most disturbing thing I heard was that the semiconductor chips that are being made in Taiwan, everybody sort of agrees with the idea that we need to move those back to the States. But he said the major problem with that is our workforce isn't educated enough. And to the point of that, as you were just saying, the issues with the First Amendment require an educated population. And our education system is broken. And we know kids did not learn math during the pandemic. And there's going to be a huge hole in the pipeline in 10 or 15 years as far as STEM is concerned. And what's the federal government doing? It just shows how interrelated all this is. But it goes to the importance of education, I think.
Yeah. Two things to that. If you really dive into the semiconductor, and there's a reason why we're focusing on semiconductors. Everything, all weapons, and I'm sorry we're only talking about weapons, because everything involves high-end semiconductors today. But when you dive into the semiconductor supply chain, this idea that the Chinese are going to invade Taiwan in order to take TSMC, the company that makes these, it's madness. It's madness. It's not going to happen. The reason it's not going to happen is because, yes, I talked about those ASML machines. Those are really important, but so are the engineers. Each one of these machines has 50 engineers. You think those engineers are sticking around? If there's a Chinese invasion, by the way, it'll all get destroyed. And the real secret sauce, yes, it's the machine and the engineers, but fabs, for those of you who don't follow this very closely, TSMC makes chips that are designed here in the United States and in Europe by designers. And so without that step, and in some ways that's the intellectually most challenging step, is designing the chips that TSMC then batch produces. So it's this immensely complicated supply chain. And again, I don't oppose, and in fact I voted for bills that we're going to, as we say, friendshore a lot of the technology. But we should A, reject the notion that the Chinese are going to invade Taiwan in order to get TSMC. They're going to do it for other reasons if they do it. And B, don't let ourselves believe that we can fix that problem because it's a massive global supply chain. On education, I don't know what to say other than how much I agree with you. It is the competitive advantage we have, and frankly, today, I'm not an education expert, but it feels to me like that competitive advantage is getting smaller. We used to have a public school system which was the envy of the entire world. Now it feels to me like, I talked about this before, it's kind of concentrated in the elite university. Like, I'm not sure that our public schools are a hell of a lot better than German gymnasiums or whatever, and that's good, but we need to do a much better job at every stage. In my world, in politics, I talk about tribalism. I'm going to go off topic here for a second, or at least off technology. One of the things that really startles me about the hatred that we have in our politics today is that the real policy differences that we have, generally, not entirely, are really small. I'm a Democrat. I probably want to spend 18% of GDP on government services. Republicans want to spend 16% of GDP on government services, right? And so our policy disagreements are actually small, and yet we use existential language. I'm not going to be partisan, but we have one candidate who is telling everybody, the country's going to hell and handbasket, we're destroying the country. No, we're not. You know, the real policy disagreements are not that big, and we need to teach people that that's the case, so that they realize that we're having a debate over relatively, there are some exceptions. The women in the room would absolutely disagree with me on where we land on reproductive rights, so I don't mean to say that everything are small differences, but the point is, you know, they're not as big as the anger would suggest that they are.
Speaking of education and trying to foster critical thinking to meet the challenges, and along the lines of what you were just mentioning, about the small differences between, let's say, 16 and 18%, and yet it's for the most part, not absolute, is those states who vote in favor of the 16% that actually get the 20% of the government thing. So at the very most basic level, critical thinking, and that's just one example of many. The other thing that I'm not sure at what point being broken that this falls in, and that is, and you were mentioning it before, and that is our education is very tribal, and many times the cultures that do the best at this spread that out. I'm thinking specifically of Finland. And would our education ever hope to meet the challenges of the future as long as it is so locally funded? And so forth. And second, and not totally unrelated question is, as I have heard these lectures and other lectures, I'm always a little bit surprised how very serious contemporary subjects can be discussed, and the subject of the current arrangements of the way we do things not being sustainable in the future never seems to come up to the surface. We talk about the scientists and the design of these complicated machines that make things. We have thousands of scientists that have come to the conclusion for 30 years now that the current trajectory that we insist on is not able to be the same trajectory in the future because it is simply mathematically impossible. So we need to start thinking about different arrangements among the many things. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Let me wander into a buzzsaw here because I want to share with you. I have no business saying this because, you know, the federal government has very little to do with local education, but I've regarded the debate which has happened in local board of eds, at my own Harvard University, at this level. I've really been saddened by the belief that the problem is that our kids, young people, are being exposed to dangerous ideas. And it's probably a little bit symmetrical. I think on the right, those dangerous ideas might, I don't know, socialism, On the left, the dangerous ideas, I guess, are white supremacy. Here's the buzzsaw. I fundamentally reject the idea that we shouldn't expose our kids to dangerous ideas. You know what dangerous ideas? Copernicus, Newton, Einstein, right? And the Inquisition wanted to talk to them about it. So I've got 2 kids. I want them, the model that they're going to school and they're rote learning socialism or whatever your thing is, oh my God, if they don't have the critical capacity to look at an idea and say, here's why it's a good idea. As it happened, I took a course on Marxism, right, in college. I'm sure that'll appear in the next political ad. But I looked at it and I thought, okay, it has certain explanatory characteristics for industrial Britain in 1900, but it's a terrible idea, it's a predictive idea, right? I mean, it turns out that humans don't want to live under communism. And so anyway, my point is obviously that, God, where did we get this idea that we need to program our kids rather than to expose them to dangerous ideas and ask them to think critically about those ideas? So anyway, that's my buzzsaw for the day.
Can you speak about the environmental climate change?
Oh, climate change. I don't know what to say beyond what you said, which is, I do know what to say. We're at a point now where, and I know it's a little bit out of fashion to say this, but we're going to rely on technology to help us solve this problem. It is very clear that we will not meet the carbon reduction trajectory, and I understand there's uncertainty in that trajectory, but it's very clear that as a result of not burning carbon, we're not going to reach the numbers that scientists tell us we need to reach. And so it will be technology, whether it is carbon capture technology or a rapid evolution to fusion or to other sources of clean energy that will save us. And I don't feel silly saying that because technology often does save us, right? There's been this Malthusian instinct in humans for hundreds of years. This idea that eventually the planet would no longer support the people on it. And they've always been wrong, and they've always been wrong because technology has allowed us to support more humans through things like higher yielding crops, etc. So, again, just to bring it back, without real innovation around things like carbon capture and sequestration and new forms of non-carbon energy, we're not going to make it. Now, I say we're not going to make it. I'm not talking about human extinction, but we're talking about an acceleration of the effects that we're already seeing in a very dangerous way.
Congressman, what is your take on the latest negotiation between the Senate and renewed aid for Ukraine and border policy? It seems like an absolute mess to me.
Yeah. It's really dispiriting. I'll have more to say next week when I go back and take a temperature. It's a bizarre problem because a supplemental contribution to Ukraine in the neighborhood of $60 billion is supported by 3/4 of the House of Representatives. As it happens, it's pretty much all the Democrats and about half the Republicans. A border package, details matter, is supported by, I will support a border package. I mean, just what we're seeing on the southern border is not tenable. You cannot have uncontrolled flows of people across the border. Now, I'm careful in saying that because I actually haven't seen the bill, and we need to do that in a humane way, consistent with our obligations in international law to provide sanctuary, etc. But anyway, my point is that this stuff, if it were brought to a vote, would pass with substantial majorities. The problem is, we're no longer a majoritarian institution. It was 9 Republicans who decided that, and I'm sorry, I don't really in this context, I don't want to sound partisan, but I just need to describe what's happening. It was 9 Republicans who decided that Kevin McCarthy should no longer be Speaker. And so they have the power to, as individuals, stop whatever it is that they don't want. So how are we going to get this thing passed? There are a couple of mechanisms. Number one, there's something called a discharge petition where, if you get the majority of the House to sign it, you can bring the bill to the floor. It's a little complicated, it's rarely used, but that's one thing that we might consider for what I regard as really important things, Ukraine and border immigration. I got myself in a little bit of trouble and a little bit famous because NBC picked up the fact that in the White House meeting I said, I sat there, as President, Congressional Leadership, and the Chairman and the Ranking Member of the National Security Committees. And for an hour and 20 minutes, senators and congressmen said how important Ukraine was and how important a border deal was. I heard Biden say 3 times, I want to do a big border deal. And I made the point, I've never been in a negotiation where I haven't heard a single person disagree with each other, because it was an hour and 20 minutes of violent agreement with each other. And so I made the point that we really need to think about solving the problem of how to put the House leadership, Mike Johnson and Hakeem Jeffries, in a position to walk on some broken glass. And candidly, it's harder for Speaker Johnson. He's got a little bit more flammable conference. So I said, let's think about how we can put Johnson in a position to do what we would like him to do. It became a big story. But it's negotiation 101, right? Help your opponent to get to yes. And so anyway, I'll be very focused in the next couple of weeks on how we might do that to get these things done.
Thank you, Jim.
Actually, thanks for being here. Thanks to the DTC for hosting this great series. I have the scariest idea so far, I think. You mentioned data, that's kind of an undercurrent. Elon Musk and his satellites, those scare the daylights out of me. He controls a lot of data and where it goes and how it gets there. Are you worried about something like that, a private interest like that, having so much control over the world's data, not just ours? Thank you.
Yeah, no, good point. I worry more about the social media platforms. Now, Musk is slowly destroying Twitter, but he has a social media platform. But I worry more about the massive repositories of personal data and behavior that Facebook and Instagram and TikTok represent, because these are things that, with our assistance, really get to know us extremely well. So I worry a lot about that and who uses that data and for what purpose. I worry about Elon Musk for a whole bunch of other reasons, but there's two reasons I worry. One, and look, we need to talk about needing to be educated. We need to understand that when we sign up for a Facebook page, you may not have read it, but you said that they can use your data. And so we need to understand that. The other thing that is worth mentioning, because I haven't mentioned it before, really critical to AI, and in fact maybe the problem today with AI, we're not dealing with some of the really truly scary problems, autonomous weapon systems. What we are dealing with AI today is embedded bias. And because bias lives in the world, misogyny, racism, bias lives in the real world, it lives in our data. And so, I'll give you a stupid example, but it's a good illustrative example. If I put together an artificial intelligence algorithm which is designed to suss out Nobel Prize winning mathematicians at age 10, it's going to look at all the data, and the first time a 10-year-old girl appears before that algorithm, the AI is going to say sorry, because of course, there's a massive historical bias in favor of men. So you get my point. We need to be exceedingly careful as we start to use algorithms for things like credit approval, admittance into buildings, resume screening, that we are super conscious of the fact that the data that is out there reflects our biases.
Congressman, thanks for doing this. Can we just go back to the semiconductor industry for a second? So, in addition to the CHIPS Act and sort of ITAR, which you talked about earlier, how do we enforce compliance, not just with China, but with some of our economic allies? Because over the years, some of the countries in Europe have sort of skirted US controls and have used technology from Chinese equipment makers like Huawei, et cetera, et cetera. So how does the government think about kind of protecting US interests from that type of behavior?
Yeah, it's a great question. I remember conversations 5 years ago, and they're not conversations that happen anymore, but 5 or 6 years ago, I remember specific conversations where a bunch of us would sit in a ministry in Whitehall in London and say, you guys are building out a Huawei system here, don't do that. And eventually they came around and they didn't, but others did. I think there's only so much we can do to compel other countries. And shame on us, by the way, 5G data services, it's kind of Huawei or one or two Scandinavian companies. We never cultivated an American champion or a British champion or what have you that could cost compete with Huawei. So you understood the buying that people, if you're Albania, right? The price difference really matters for the building out of a cellular network that your people really want. So There's only so much we can do to compel people against their economic interests, but I do think that the environment has caused a lot of countries to realize that when they adopt Chinese technology, there's some very real risks involved. The complete mishandling of the Belt and Road Initiative by the Chinese and what that has done to African countries, the world is now a little sensitized to the sort of predatory quality of some of this technology and investment and that kind of thing. So I wish I had a silver bullet for you, but I do. It's a very different environment than it was 6-7 years ago. Largely because the Chinese have gotten so aggressive, the saber rattling around Taiwan, the provision of all kinds of resources to the Russians and stuff. The world is reacting to that.
Jim, I had a chance to read the report from the National Commission on Social Security Reform, also known as the Greenspan Commission from 1983. 427 pages, and if you have any trouble sleeping, I highly recommend it. One thing and it was the UC Regents who were looking for a report on structural way to sustain Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and what kind of structural things could be brought to the fore. One thing I noticed when I read that was a lot of the people on the commission, like Claude Peppers and Greenspan himself, were all born between 1910 and 1930. So right now, that was sort of the technology. Big data wasn't in their oversight, right? Could we get a bipartisan commission appointed in the next administration to readdress this, start to deal with the HIPAA issues, the Medicare, because you know how the discretionary line item goes versus the Social Security line item, the Medicare line item, and the other medical costs that we have, because those are eating us alive and it needs to be addressed. Do you think we could get a commission formed using better technology, better knowledge, big data as we've discussed, to try to address the issue?
Yeah. A little off topic from technology, but it's a really important question. We did have one such commission in my freshman term. You may recall the Simpson-Bowles Commission was put together to really get serious about addressing the long-term budget issues. And you'll know that we're serious, and I don't know when it'll happen, but you know that we'll be serious about addressing our long-term budget sustainability and our debt sustainability when we start with the discussion about Social Security and Medicare. It is dishonest but very easy for people like me to point to 0.5% of the budget, which feels a little wasteful. 40! Why are we spending money in Gambia when we have roads built here? Our entire foreign aid budget is about 1% of the overall federal budget, and it's not growing. Not because anybody did anything wrong, and Social Security and Medicare are critical programs for the American people, but the population is aging. And so the percentage of people who are beneficiaries of those programs relative to the younger folks who are paying into those programs has turned on its head. So you'll know that we're honest. I get nervous even saying it, but you'll know that we're honest about it when we start with that and say, how can we, in such a way that doesn't damage low-income seniors who rely only on their Social Security check, or only, how can we fix those programs so that they are sustainable and available to my children and grandchildren's generation? That will be the start of an honest conversation. The other piece of that honest and candidly, the reason I tell you I feel nervous saying that is that, candidly, my party is not entirely honest about that, right? We're in the process, some of us, not me, because I was actually a believer in the Simpson-Bowles Commission, are in the process of trying to stop such a commission. There's dishonesty on the other side, too, which is that, massive tax cuts don't increase the deficit. Massive tax cuts do increase the deficit. And so
16% doesn't work.
If you look at the real drivers of our deficit and our debt in this country, it is the increasing drag by these wonderful programs, pretty dramatic tax cuts over the years, and oh, by the way, a bunch of wars that were fabulously expensive that we didn't actually raise tax to pay for. So you'll know that we're having a real conversation when those are what we're talking about, rather than foreign aid or waste, fraud, and abuse and other things that make it very easy for people like me to avoid the hard issues.
Hello. I really liked the theme in your talk about technology's capabilities exceeding ethics capabilities. So I was curious, when do you think America has had a really strong shared ethical core? Do you think we could pull it off now? Especially since I don't think there's as much of a business model in shared ethical core as there is in, say, quantum computing or biosynthesis?
It's a great question. I think there are a couple of models, and then I'm going to have one big picture thought. The couple of models that seem to have worked were, for example, let's take what we used to call kind of recombinant biology, we now call it biosynthesis. There is a model of self-regulation. So this idea of making new creatures or messing around with the human genome or messing around with human stem cells, which are basically the cells that would allow you to basically grow a human. Geneticists have globally self-regulated in a competent way. And you may even remember about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a Chinese scientist who messed around with the human genome in a stem cell, and there was all sorts of approbation and sanctions that were heaped on it. So that's a model that works reasonably well. Arguably breaking down a little bit in this very polarized environment. You know, the Chinese were not helpful. We raised all kinds of hell in, probably inappropriate ways, but the Chinese were really not very helpful when it came to solving the origins of coronavirus and providing data. So I do get a little nervous about that scientific self-regulatory model. And then we have, government regulation. And I think that when it comes to things, a lot of technologies, that's appropriate. But as you sensed from my talk, when we're talking about information, it becomes really challenging in a society that is dedicated to not having government impede the flow of information. And finding that line. I mean, here's one. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but the state of Montana prohibited TikTok. Yeah, wow, right? On the one hand, yes, it's a Chinese-owned company, and at any time, Beijing could say to TikTok, give us all your information. By the way, we can kind of do that too in this country. There's just a little more legal procedure around it than the Chinese have to employ. But I also thought, oh my God, really? We're going to forbid a media platform? Where's the limiting factor? Where's the limiting principle on this? Are we going to start forbidding newspapers? So anyway, I use that to just illustrate that regulation has served us pretty well, and sometimes we do too much, and sometimes we do too little. But when it comes to information, regulation is really, really hard.
In terms of social media and information and misinformation, you mentioned that people would learn how to recognize misinformation. But what I see is that people no longer even trust information. And they would rather get their news from someone like the Omaha cat lady than from the New York Times. This is a real person, by the way. And so what I find distressing is that you can give somebody information from a reputable source, and they'd rather say, I believe some random person on social media.
Yeah.
And how do you address that, I guess?
No, it's great. Look, the way I talk about that problem is, and I'm guilty of this. I doom scroll and, oh my gosh, look at this cat. I mean, I'm guilty of this. More than ever before, we've got the opportunity to blend entertainment and our understanding of our democracy and news, right? And we say news, oh, news is boring. News is how we become good citizens, right? I mean, it's really essential to the democratic process. And more those two things there's no bright line between entertainment and news. I won't say what I said before, but we've got a real obligation to, as parents, as school systems and everything else, to really embrace the notion with our young people that, if you are not a critical thinking, competent citizen of a democracy, you will lose your democracy. So that's point one. Point two, I guess I worry. It's not clear to me that this is fundamentally an evidence problem. And again, I apologize in this context for sounding partisan, but I was looking at the polling around the Republican electorate in Iowa, and apparently 75% or so of the folks that voted for Donald Trump, which was a majority, really believe that the election was stolen. Not a shred of evidence, There have been 60 court cases. And again, I hate to sound partisan, but I think we need to deal with this. People believe what they really want to believe. Evidence be damned. And in some ways, I'd really like to think more about that problem. I want to be really respectful because of what SE went through, but Taylor Swift was there was this deep fake porn thing on Taylor Swift. I'm not sure that a lot of Americans were like, Taylor Swift made a porno. I'm skeptical that there was that, and yet we do have a lot of Americans believing things for which there is zero evidence, and I wish I had the answer to that.
One more?
Yes.
All right, just one more, and then he has to go.
Thank you, Mr. Himes. I'm a psychotherapist. I work in town. I work with lots of children. My question is where social media sort of intersects addiction and the federal government response in terms of, I understand what you're saying about, the Second Amendment and free speech, and yet at the same time knowing we have evidence-based that social media platforms have embedded addiction. We have children who have so much social media addiction and just the content that is really not protected for them. Where are you with that, and where's the federal government with that in terms of protecting our children?
And are you talking about things that sort of tacitly encourage the use of drugs and that sort of thing?
It's anything. I mean, it's from drugs to illegal content. It's from suicide. It's the gambit of what's going on in the mental health crisis today.
Yeah. I guess I continue to believe that this is a really hard problem because, again, it's going to be very hard for the government to say, you can't say this. There is a door, though, that I think that can be opened when there's palpable and provable harm, and that's liability. And I'm not a lawyer, but I've gotten really interested in this question because if you can prove harm from speech, you can be held liable. And I know that there's a lot of people, lawyers far smarter than me, working on this idea of trying to establish a causal link between kids who are addicted to social media and to things like eating disorder and drug use and that sort of thing. So I hope I'm not putting too much hope in the process of liability, but I do know that that's a real threat to social media platforms that aren't thoughtful about what they put out there. So I am hopeful that we will, as my friend Tom Malinowski, who was in Congress for a little while in New Jersey, he lost his seat, but he made the point, which is you have the right to say what you want, but you don't have a right to have what you say amplified. And if bad and pathological ideas are being amplified, there should be liability to whatever mechanism is doing that.
Thank you so much.